All right. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Tactical Urbanism Summit for Winterruption, created by the Western Cultural Center and other organizations like Art City and Winnipeg Trails. This panel is specifically important to us because we want to think about the people that live in the core. Who are we? What kind of people are we? Are we really cool? I know we're really cool. So we put together a very cool group of panelists with all different backgrounds, and that will have different opinions. It'll be really awesome. I would leave them to it. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Aurora Debreuil. I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator with the West End Biz. I'll be helping moderate this panel. So maybe just to start, we can go around and quickly introduce everyone. We'll start with Shauna.
Sure. Hi, I'm Shauna Mackinnon. I'm a professor at the University of Winnipeg and the Department of Urban and Inner City Studies, and we're actually situated at Merchants Corner on Selkirk Avenue, just north of the tracks.
My name is Darcy Adaman. I'm the founder and CEO of Make Music Matter.
Nancy, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Nancy Hansen. I'm the Director of Disability Studies at the University of Manitoba, and I'm excited to be here in this accessible format. Thank you very much.
Albert?
Hi, so my name is Albert, and I'm the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg.
Great. So we'll start off. We're going to just go through some questions, have some discussion, and just see where it takes us. So we'll maybe just start about talking about what the cultural composition of Winnipeg is and the core, and who exactly lives in the core. So it's going to look and sound a little different from everyone's perspective, but I think that's what will kind of help us get a better shape of what we can think of when we're thinking of the core. So does anyone want to kick us off on who they think lives in the core? Nancy and Albert, I'll just say maybe just put your hand up just so I can see it if you want to go next. So maybe Nancy, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I'm here as I'm a representative of the 1.3 billion disabled people in the world. We are the world's largest minority, and we're often present and, well, we're almost always present and often overlooked. In Manitoba, we are one in four, and nationally, we are 22% of the working age population. So I think that when we think of people living in the core, that disability often gets overlooked, and it's important to remember that disability is everywhere, even though it may not be identified, and disabled people don't necessarily come equipped with hardware such as crutches or wheelchairs or canes. The majority of disability is invisible, but that's not to say we're not there. So I think that when we're talking about the core and who lives here, we have to remember that disability is always here, but not always recognized, because we have Western culture has a very sort of individualized crisis response to disability and disability issues. I think what I would like to say is that disability needs to be regularized and naturalized as a natural part of the human variation, and not to be seen as chronically unexpected.
And I think Albert's hand was raised. Maybe we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I'm here. So when it comes to the core, I am very much interested about the demographic data of who lives in the Winnipeg core. And according to the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, we have 230 neighborhoods in Winnipeg, and the core has 39 neighborhoods. And we are mostly concerned about the demographics because the demographics tells us who we are, where we've been to, where we are going. It explains to test of everything, what products will be in demand, where jobs will occur, and what school enrollments will be, and when houses values will rise and drop, and what kinds of people and food that we will demand, and the kinds of cars that we will drive. So I'm more concerned about the city's definition for the inner city as to how we can help to make evidence-based decision-making based on the conflicting issues always prevailing in the core. So issues like poverty, issues like housing, issues like food access, and issues relating to crime. So I am more concerned about demographic data, and I'm very happy that I'm here to be part of, uh, uh, to present some of the ideas that I have from demographic data.
Great. Any Shauna or anything to add to that?
Okay, so, yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was first thinking about, well, how are we defining the core? Because that's always a question as well. People have different boundaries that they look at. So, I'm including in my definition just, often people forget about north of the tracks, which I believe is part of the core in my view. But it's fairly a broad area. And I think it's probably far more diverse than maybe we often think, just in terms of economically diverse, ethnically diverse. I think that there is a lot of diversity in the core, and so, who we are is like, some of us are representing some of those people, and there are many others as well.
I'll just take a little bit of a different angle on that. In my neighborhood in the Exchange, there's some really cool people that live there that I don't think people know about or celebrated enough. So, and sorry, I'm not trying to bring attention to myself per se, but with myself as a founder of a charity that now works in 8 countries, and I have a partner in New York where we're doing films together, and the other people in my building and my neighbors, they're MPs, they're senators, doctors, lawyers, worldwide known architects, like some amazing people. And I don't think we know that enough, is the truth. And they're choosing to live in the core. They could be anywhere in the world, some of these people, but they choose to be there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Maybe I'll give some fun stats about the West End, just because we're in here, or we're in the West End right now. So when we think of the West End, we think of our zone, which runs from the University of Winnipeg all the way basically to Strathcona Street, and then from Portage to Notre Dame. And so within just that little slice of the core, there's 35,000 people, which is about the same size as Steinbach, Stonewall, and Portage La Prairie combined. So we have a very dense neighborhood, which is something I think to be very proud of, and maybe isn't really thought of that much when you think of the West End. It's just a residential area, but it's a very dense residential area. And one of the densest neighborhoods in Winnipeg is actually Central Park. And so we have some stuff to build off of, starting with that. So maybe as we kind of expand on who lives in the core, we can also kind of shift to who lives in the suburbs. So we've kind of heard a bit about we've got some cool people in the core. I'm sure there's some cool people in the suburbs too. But yeah, like what do we hear, and what do we know about the folks that are living out there, maybe why they choose to live out there? Anyone?
Sorry, I might need a moment. That's a good question. That one I might need a moment on.
I'll just jump in. I think the suburbs are also very diverse, right? I mean, they're, if I look at, so for example, a lot of friends of mine live out around the University of Manitoba. That's where they work. And extremely diverse neighborhood around there. And that's the suburbs. So I think if you go to any community really in Winnipeg, you would see a fair bit of diversity. Again, how you define diversity also, right? Like it's really how you're defining diversity. So I think while they're probably somewhat economically diverse, some of those neighborhoods, I think the economic diversity actually is more pronounced in the core. And just the example that Darcy gave of some of the folks living in your building, then you look at, neighborhoods like around where urban inner city studies is on Merchants Corner, it's extremely economically poor. And it is also highly represented by Indigenous people, a lot of newcomers, and you don't see, the senators, right? So the diversity is, I think, everywhere in the city, but I think more pronounced actually in the core.
That's a interesting point, because even though I'm technically in this exchange, I think we call it North Point Douglas in terms of the riding, which is the poorest riding in Canada, literally. But yet we have all these interesting people there.
Yeah, yeah.
Albert, maybe I'll go. I saw your hand up there for a moment.
Yes. Yeah. There is a huge reduction of people living in the core in the last few decades. And that is because of the bad perception, and I will say, the huge, like a significant number of people are facing a lot of social and economic challenges. Right now, 2021 pre-census data is showing that a lot of people are leaving Winnipeg. Like in 1977, we had a close number of 30% of people living in Winnipeg's inner core. And in 2016, it reduced to 17%. And in the pre-data that we are receiving from Statistics Canada, the number keeps on reducing. And that is because, even if you take, the pandemic out, you still see a number of people moving out of Winnipeg's inner core. And that is because of the bad perception, because people think there are a lot of crimes. People think that you can always get hurt when you walk late night in downtowns and that kind of thing. So all those things are issues that are preventing people to live in their core.
Nancy, do you want to add anything?
Nobody is just one thing. Like, we tend to silo that separate various marginalized groups into sections. And I think that it's important to recognize that nobody's just one thing. A lot of people who live in the core live well below the poverty line, and they live there because they don't have access to their regularized transportation. They have to make their own way of getting to spaces and places where they need to be. People don't have cars. They don't have alternate options for transportation. They don't have ready access to food and employment. So they go to the places where, number one, they're accessible for a lot of reasons. Number two, they can get there on their own power. And it's a space that people make their own comfort zone based on the reasons they have for being there in the first place. But I think it provides more access to the resources that you require to live your life. And I think a lot of disabled people, for example, live in the core because there is an ability to at least access some resources based on excuse me, the mouth and the brain have to connect together here for a sec. They're making their way on their own terms, using the space that they can access on their own terms, and not having to rely on other mechanisms to get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important, and that kind of ties back to something we were talking about earlier of like having a 15-minute city, of making sure everything is accessible for all modes of transportation and families, people who have disabilities, people who maybe can't afford a car, all very important things to keep in mind. So maybe kind of shifting gears, when we think about people living in the core areas, how do you think they're represented when it comes to policy and decision making? I think a few of us have kind of touched on it briefly, but maybe kind of what have we seen, and maybe we can then go from there on what we would like to see.
Hmm.
Anyone want to start us off?
Again, excellent question. I'm trying to. Well, sorry, this is not a perfect answer, but when you're talking about policy and representation, I think both sides are not represented correctly, in the sense that the people I rattled off, and like they're living in my building, just great, phenomenal people doing stuff around globally, have a global footprint. That group is certainly not considered in policy in Winnipeg, and that's why we get a brain drain, and it does worry me. And then on the other side, we have, again, it's a large disenfranchised homeless contingency in the exchange, as you know, and the same thing, they're equally excluded. And I'm sorry, that's not a perfect answer, but I do see it on both sides in terms of I don't think we're actually involved in that in any of that policy on both extremes.
Yeah. I think also one thing that comes to mind for me when I think of, who are we thinking of when it comes to policy making is I often feel like young people are forgotten a lot, which is maybe an odd thing, but I often think of, university students and maybe people that are getting their first apartment and then later on want to, buy their first home or first condo. And we're not necessarily taking into consideration what they might think is a desirable place to live, and rather we're just letting them go off to bigger cities or other places that already have these things. And maybe, just how can we kind of create what seems so desirable in these other cities here? I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that.
I can go next.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure how all this works with
I don't want to leave
Nancy and
anyone
Albert,
out.
so if I jump in whenever. It's interesting, because I was thinking it more in the line of, okay, well, theoretically, we should all be represented because we all have elected officials that we, elect and that should be representing us. But the reality is, of course, that there are some voices that are louder than others in those constituencies. So the folks that we've all just talked about end up not being represented. And so that is problematic, and again, speaks to the issues that we talked about in the last panel around that's why you need, people actively engaged from the ground up to hold those elected officials accountable to make sure the voices are heard. But I also think it's beyond that. It's because it's the elected officials who, are making policy, but it's also people who work within the bureaucracies that are doing the work of policy making directed by their political masters. And I don't believe that's very representative of the folks that we're talking about. Because typically, again, this is, being fairly generalizing, but the folks who are working in positions in government tend to be middle-class folks, still typically white, not diverse, certainly not, representing, people with disabilities enough, so it's unless we have that kind of diversity throughout the system in terms of the political system and through bureaucracies, I don't really think that we're ever going to see that kind of representation because people just are coming with a different lens to their work.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, and as I think what I was trying to say, it's like, again, on both extremes.
Yes.
So that lack of representation, and I have a privileged life, I'm not denying that whatsoever, but I do feel a lack of representation because of the outside the box things that comprise my life. My whole life is outside the box that way. It's not really well received, quite frankly, in terms of any of it. If I talk to people about, what my organization has done, I honestly just get, even from policymakers, like, why? Like, why, huh? Why'd you do that? If, I hate to say it, but if I'm in New York or something like that and I talk about this idea, people are just like, great, go for that. And it does make you feel, honestly, just more welcome. And on the other side of it, since I live in the exchange, and we've tried doing this with groups unsuccessfully, we've tried telling the policymakers, we don't want blanket gentrification. These other people are part of our community. We just can't push them away somewhere else. That's also not right. How do we bring it all together? Unsuccessful so far, quite frankly, and it's been a frustration.
One thing that's always kind of troubled me is when I go to these, workshops or, they do these, kind of like this, a panel where they want to hear feedback mostly from the city. And, they're usually in the evening, maybe 6 o'clock. It's a 3-hour, recently been over Zoom. But, and when I go on these, I never see representation from more than someone who looks like me and, middle class, who has 3 hours to spend to talk about this, who, isn't making dinner for their kids and isn't taking someone to soccer practice. And it always struck me as there's no way we're getting a good representation here of what people actually want or even need. And maybe kind of looking at ways that we can go directly to the source rather than forcing folks to come to us always. Nancy, I see your hands up.
Policymakers tend to do things the same way. And if you keep doing something the same way and being very process oriented and expecting a different result, that's incredibly problematic. I mean, policymakers are very keen on tinkering around the edges and maybe changing language, but really sort of deconstructing and reconstructing the way they do things. They're not so keen on doing that because they're very comfortable with traditional past practice. And if you do that and expect a different result, I'm sorry, you're going to be mistaken if you because you're going to replicate what's gone before, and the replication leads to people that look like you, work like you, and move like you. So I mean, it doesn't present avenues for marginalized population groups to access policy making processes, because often people just go through the motions of consultation without really taking stuff on board substantively.
And to use the buzzword of inclusivity again in policymaking, case in point, let me just quickly ask to Jorge, how wide is this going out right now?
How wide?
Yeah.
It's going on the internet.
All right, okay, whatever. We'll see what happens. So even in between the two panels, when we're downstairs for lunch, I got an email, let's say someone from the government with letters H and S, that wanted me to come in, again, to our legislator, and again, certain people I shouldn't name, to present on what my organization is doing, because we're starting to go into Indigenous communities to do our work as well. So they asked me to come in. Nowhere in the email was, can you bring someone from that community as well? It's going to be a bunch, honestly, like you said, a bunch of middle-aged, like me, white males, ministers, and nowhere in the email was, please bring a representative of the community. I have not responded to the email yet.
Well, and I think that's something that a lot of people, struggle and have to navigate is, you want to do something helpful and you want to, add to the community, but you also, like you're saying in the exchange, you don't want to be pushing people that are making up the community out. And you need to there needs to be a balance between how do we grow this community and make it a successful community, but also not just pushing that issue or those people onto another neighborhood. And I think that, I think that's something that the core is facing right now, as there's so much talk of development and how we need to get more people living downtown. We also need to recognize that there is people that are living downtown, but they maybe aren't homed, and that we can't just push that somewhere else. And how do we build that kind of relationship and community together? Which I guess kind of brings me to maybe what are some of the struggles that we have in our core that we're facing, and solutions, if anyone has any.
I don't know if sorry, I'm just going to finish off from what you were saying before. As the core in our neighborhood, in the Exchange and Waterfront, it's developing. It's wonderful to see. But again, I do not want to push out the original people there at all. And honestly, neither do my neighbors and friends that live down there. That's why we like it. It's a vibrant community. But the more and more that gets separated, again, it's going to, I think, cause longer term problems. You know, in an extreme case in point, I just want to give this example. I remember 3 years ago, I was shooting a documentary in Philadelphia. And we were filming in sort of a bad neighborhood where the gangs and the drugs are. There's a huge opioid crisis there. And I quickly realized that the police there and all that had nothing to do with protect and serve or the community. It was containment. That's all they cared about, was making sure the problem stayed in that neighborhood and didn't get pushed into another neighborhood. And then it just becomes worse and worse and worse and worse. And then that neighborhood becomes like a literal, war zone. Sorry, just had to go for it.
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, there are many issues. And there's just no political will to do what needs to be. That's the bottom line, right? And so I would just argue, just from my perspective, I feel the biggest issue right now is the housing issue, and home for people who are homeless, but also people who are inadequately housed, people who can't afford. They're living in places that are just in really ill repair, and landlords who don't care. They're just getting what they can out of the, taking the rent and not doing any repairs to the building. Like, this is a huge issue, and there is all sorts of research that indicates what needs to be done to address housing for people who are lowest income. Needs to be done through social housing. Market's not gonna solve this problem. Not suggesting the market can't create other kinds of good housing, but it's not gonna create housing for the lowest income folks. And there's no doubt that there is a solution, but it's expensive, right? And so if governments of all levels, but particularly the federal and provincial governments, need to invest in more social housing, they need to invest in repairing the social housing that exists, but there's just no political will because it's seen as a cost. And then just getting to what you're saying, if we want to create inclusive neighborhoods and not push people out, we need to have housing in those neighborhoods that's accessible to them. So again, using the Exchange, because I think it's a great example, because I don't live in the Exchange, but it is a great neighborhood. So welcoming folks of all different income levels is fine, but as you say, but then what are we doing to make it accessible so that people who are currently there actually have housing that's affordable to them? But then you also get into this issue, and I'm not suggesting it's in your neighborhood, but it is an issue the NIMBY issue around, like we don't want this in our backyard because then it affects our property values. And so there's all that goes on. So we've got like big issues just in terms of how we look at what we mean about inclusive neighborhoods. We get caught up in our own idea of what housing is for us, and often, it's a commodity. Like, so it's an asset that that's an important asset for a lot of people. Sometimes it's their only asset. But it's until there's a political will to invest. Like, I feel it needs to start with housing, because from housing comes people being able to access education, having a safe place to go that then they don't have to worry about, some other things. That's when you have, if it's affordable for you, then you can buy your own food. You don't have to rely on a food bank. It's sort of the fundamental thing that we all need to live. And so, there are many issues, but I feel that's sort of the primary one that we really need to be addressing in a more significant way. Sorry, I went on way too long there.
Nancy, we'll maybe go to you next.
Albert, did you want to go first? Because your hand was up before mine and then it disappeared.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So to add to what Shauna said, housing is a key thing that we need to tackle, because even in the core neighborhoods, we have more than 11 seniors that are in need of core housing needs. Seniors in inner city needs core housing, and that means social housing, and housing needs to be subsidized. And like he said, there has to be a political will to make sure that it's engagement from the three levels of government to put this thing in place. It's something that we need to tackle that. And I will also talk about food. Food accessibility is very low in the inner cities, and that's because people don't have money to buy food. And Winnipeg, Manitoba Harvest has shown that even in 2015, we had a huge number of people in the inner city accessing food from the food banks. And that's because a lot of them are living in low incomes, and it really affects people a lot there. And, from housing, then we also deal with education as well. So good point, Shauna. I appreciate your point there. And it's something that I have really captured in my notes as well.
Is problematized as opposed to seeing an opportunity, right? As opposed to a problem that needs to be dealt with. I think there needs to be a serious shift in perspective, because as soon as something you don't want to have to deal with something. Nobody wants to feel like they're being dealt with. So I think that we have to have a serious change in expectation for all marginalized population groups, and expect that these are opportunities for creative change as opposed to problems that need to be dealt with. I think there has to be a shift in perspective from the get-go, and that will sort of really influence the way these issues are addressed, as opposed to being problematic.
Yeah, and with that, that's a great point, Nancy. Addressing that, how do we do that and strip away the power paradigm with it as well? Because inevitably what happens, I think, in a subtle or not so subtle way, is that if you're working with a marginalized group, it feels like, well, I'm giving you something. Mm-hmm. And that is not good for bringing someone's agency back. My charity works with extremely vulnerable populations all over the world. And, we're very careful on, we're not giving you something. We're giving, it's simply tools to get your agency back. And I don't have the solution, but I think that's another issue with that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you raised a good point, Darcy, when you talked about this email you received and being invited to come and not being, those are the areas that we all need to push back on, because you're right. Why is it that, you're the folks that you're working with in the Indigenous community are not invited?
Yeah.
And it's also the case, sometimes those folks at the ledge in this case need to get out, right? Go out to where people are and talk to people in their own spaces and communities about what it is that they need and want, rather than inviting people, and especially people who are not comfortable with those spaces, have never been in those spaces. It's extremely intimidating.
Absolutely.
So, then there's no reason why that can't happen, right? Yeah. That people can't get out into communities and talking to people where they're at. So anyway, I'll be interested to see how your exchange goes from here.
Yes, some things I'll just
Good luck with
leave
that.
off there. Thank you.
So maybe to bring it back to the core a bit, so when we think of Winnipeg's core, it kind of sounds like we all have an idea of what Winnipeg's core looks like, but how does that compare to other cities and what we think of their core? For instance, in my head, I'm thinking of, downtown Toronto. I think very wealthy folks, business folks, bankers, lots of stuff bustling and going on. But I don't think of that when I think of Winnipeg's core. I would say I think, maybe just off the top of my head, I would say it's a pretty quiet core. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of culture when you start digging and you find these pockets, in the West End or in North End. But I wouldn't say our core is as common, or maybe it is common, but just you've traveled quite a bit. How would you maybe compare our core to other cities' core?
I think and hopefully I get this out correctly. For me, I think the main difference in a bigger city like a Toronto or New York, whatever, is when I'm there with a colleague or a friend who's I'll just say a well-known person in the world, they're still living their life in their neighborhood like a normal person. It makes, I was just in Toronto, I won't name drop, with some well-known people. We went to dinner, we walked home together. Like it's just how they live, and they feel at home. But I think we do have an issue here when someone gets any degree of unusual success where they don't feel that same welcomeness, and then they leave. And I think that's a huge detriment to our city, quite honestly. I'm not sure. Hopefully that answered your, but that's sort of honestly the main
Okay.
difference I see.
Interesting. Albert, maybe we'll go to you next.
Yeah. So I have stayed in Calgary downtown a couple of times, and what I noticed was there was a lot of decency. Everyone was decent, and I think the mindset that I had was, Calgary is like an American-based city, so almost everyone live their life like the way they want it, right? But I took a few classes, a couple of classes. 9 times in University of Winnipeg when I was doing my master's. And anytime I close from class, there is this perception that I have always held within me that I can be hurt when I'm going to get onto the bus to leave. And I guess that notion is something that we need to try and then demystify how all those things we can get rid of it. And that is about the fact that we've always had this, publicly held notion that downtown Winnipeg is crazy. Anybody can hurt you. You can't walk there at night. Somebody can just wound you with a knife. And I think if you're able to demystify that, that can really help us. And that has to do with, racism. We always feel that, somebody can just meet you along the way and then ask you for something. And when you don't barge in, the person can really hurt you. But in Calgary downtown, where I have been there a couple of times, the core is always decent. Almost everyone is happy and they are living fine.
I'm kind of just wondering too a little bit about just in terms of the size of our city and just the issues around density. And then so you give the example of Toronto, and obviously there's a lot more density in the core. But it's also our core too seems to be fairly large, right? Like, I mean, geographically large, not dense. And so it is. So you just mentioned how it kind of feels empty. So that's part of the challenge. And there's also the other barriers that exist. So again, the example I'll give is the barrier that exists that separates the north end from the south end, the rail yards. I mean, there's been for, since at least the 70s, people have been talking about, we really need to move those rail yards and build, there, which would again add, it would connect the two, but it would also add to the density of the core. Because I think that's part of it, right? People go out and they walk and there's places to go and you've got, all sorts of people from different, it's a bit more like this in the exchange, I feel like, in terms of people are out a lot more than in some of the other areas. It seems like until we have a more densely populated core, people living and working, all sorts of housing, all of those things that we all dream of, like we're not going to tackle these issues. And people will move away, right? Like people, this idea that we should be living in these neighborhoods because we want to live in them, not because, I have to live there because it's all I can afford to live on Selkirk Avenue or whatever. Like, that's not why we should want to live in the core. We should want to live in the core because they're vibrant places to live, and we want to be part of that. And there's a little too much of the, I live here because, we certainly see this in our area, I live here because it's all that I can afford, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
And case in point, in terms of density in our neighborhood, the density is not there enough to have a grocery store yet.
Exactly.
And that drives me crazy because I have to always drive to.
Yeah.
I don't want to, honestly.
Yeah. Nancy, do you have anything to add there?
Yes, I think people go where it's accessible, and however accessibility is defined, they go where places are most accessible to them, right? Be it physical accessibility, attitudinal accessibility, or resource accessibility. You go where you can make the most comfortable space for yourself, a space that works for you. And if I can just get back to my own constituency for a second, as a disabled person, I've been recently talking to people living in Toronto, and talking about living in Toronto is really difficult because it's very expensive, number one, and housing is expensive, and accessible housing, regardless of income level, people that require accessible housing go where the access is. And in a lot of cases in Toronto anyway, and I think it's mirrored here to a certain extent, the accessible housing is in the most, shall we say, undesirable neighborhoods. There's a lot of um, connection and intersection of the assumption that people who require physically accessible housing are found within a certain specific income group or whatever. And so, and there's an assumption that there's only a few of us, so what's the big deal? So, you have the stigma of disability coupled with the stigma of where accessible housing is. So that's where you need to be in order to um, have the support services and physical access that you need, which is endemic of systemic ableism. And uh, however populations are marginalized, disability being just one of them, there's an inbuilt uh, um, understanding of how certain populations live, or where they live as opposed to where we live, quote unquote. So I think there's a sort of privilege assumptions are built into a lot of this, right? And we have to get rid of that crap, or at least recognize what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have a sort of greater barrier for a greater understanding of what inclusion, excuse me, really means, as opposed to setting the bar so low that if you can just, if you can just the whole concept, for example, of visitability, I find deeply troubling, in that you can show up and you might be able to pee, but other than that, forget it. We don't expect you to be there on a regular basis, but we'll let you show up and visit from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Maybe we can kind of talk about our neighbors. So when I think of, a neighborhood and, meeting your neighbors, what comes to mind is a row of houses and, people maybe playing in the streets, whatever. But as I, have lived in Winnipeg, I've lived in an apartment the whole time. The concept of neighbor is kind of shifting for me, and what that looks like. And I think maybe it might be kind of interesting to kind of talk about what your neighbor is, or where you meet your neighbor in a much more dense neighborhood, like most cores. And then that kind of maybe builds into why it's so important to have these public spaces and areas that we can connect with our community, that's accessible for everyone. And yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that, or if that can build off something. Like, you live in the Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say your neighbors are in your building, or would you think more just is the coffee shop owner downstairs or something?
It's
like
both.
That? Yeah.
It's really both. We're case in point to the earlier panel, when I said people always shockingly ask me, do I go out at night? And
Yeah.
they're like, are you kidding me? Of course. It is so friendly.
Yeah.
Like, I'm on a group text with like 3 couples in my building where, it's like an episode of Friends, my building. It's really lovely because it's kind of just, everyone does different things, but like-minded, creative people.
Yeah.
It's incredibly friendly. You know, and during COVID, there is we have a common area deck, and it's what saved us all
Yeah.
because that was the only thing we can do. We'd text each other, say, "Okay, are we going outside tonight?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go outside
Yeah.
tonight." It was really wonderful, and that goes to the buildings across the street, to the coffee shop owner.
Yeah.
It's a really lovely little contained. It's almost like a little village, honestly.
Yeah.
I find it incredibly friendly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing I've found too, is just like how important these small businesses, have been even throughout COVID, of just when you have very minimal interaction, just going to get that coffee or going to grab your baked goods. That was, that little interaction actually really kind of makes you feel okay.
Oh, yeah.
Everything's going to be okay. And I think that's so important, and you can lose a lot of that when, we're kind of growing into the suburbs and it's more larger box stores, and there's not that kind of mom and pop shop that, the convenience store on the corner that you go to every night to grab treats or whatever it is. And that really kind of helps create a sense of community in these more dense neighborhoods, that it might be harder to envision what your neighborhood feels like, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, where you can walk across the street to whatever the lounge is and run into half your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it's so welcoming.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I would say the same for me. We live in a house, but it's, again, sort of in the core, and lots of local businesses, which is we support. So I've never really thought of them as my neighbors, but yeah, you just know folks, right? Like it's people have owned these places for a long time. So, but I would also say that on our block, and it goes back to what you're talking about, these common spaces, right? Like, because they're all we have little yards in our area, people spend their time in the front. And so some of us that have little kids, they're running around in the front. And it's like people recognize that this is the play space for everybody, right? And so our yards are all sort of left to accommodate that, right? So we don't have fences on our yards, and we don't have, obstacles so that the kids can run up and down. So there's just almost like this understanding that we don't have big yards, so the yard is everybody. Everybody's yard is for everybody. People have their fire pits out in the front, and you sit out, you maybe have a beer or something in the evening, and just people come over. So that's how you develop a neighborhood, right? It's being out and talking to people. Yeah. And you could do that in apartments too, like as you're talking about. It's just all about the willingness to be out and engaging with people. And the also the benefit of also the diversity, because the other challenge I find is that there are differences in terms of people who, it's length of time you've lived in a space, but it's also it really is a division between renters and homeowners. And so it really is incumbent upon the homeowners to reach out to the people who rent to make them feel included as well, because it really is easy to fall into that trap, right? Is because people are more transient, coming and going, and they don't feel as part of a neighborhood. So, we're far from perfect, but we try to do that as well, recognizing that we've got a pretty economically diverse block, and recognizing that we need to be inclusive of the other folks too. So, there's all things you can do, but it's really up to people to sort of make a neighborhood wherever it is that they are.
Yeah. Okay. Albert or Nancy, do you want to add anything to that?
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go for it, Nancy.
No, go ahead. You first.
Okay.
Too polite.
Well, so I like what Darcy and Shauna said, but currently data is pointing to the fact that Winnipeg is not becoming more friendly, and that is because people are generally not friendly, and it's based on the myth. So the pre-data that we are having is showing that a lot of people are moving from Winnipeg to Niverville, and the population there has increased significantly. And that's because even in those places where people don't live in apartment blocks and they are living in houses, they are still able to connect with each other. In Winnipeg, where we have a lot of people living in apartments, living in a apartment close by, it's becoming difficult to connect with their neighbors. I don't live in the core, but where I live, people are friendly. And it's difficult on my part to connect with people, and that's because I see them not to be friendly. Sometimes you try to provide some sort of helping hand to somebody, and the person feels like, don't worry, I can do it myself. But that has always been my way of trying to get to know people, right? So sometimes I think it depends on how dense the place is and how friendly the neighborhood that you are living in. So when it comes to be who my neighbor is, you can always make a case that, somebody who is living next block to you is your neighbor. But as to how the person connects with you, it's probably different sometimes.
Nancy?
There's one thing I'd like to sort of touch on for a sec. It's the ability for spontaneity. A lot of times, disabled people do not have the opportunity, specifically people with physical disabilities don't have that opportunity to be spontaneous because we have to check and see if a space is truly accessible. If we can get into the space, I know I'm focusing on toilets, but they are a reality. Yeah, you can get in, but if you can't pee, what's the point? And to get business owners to expect disabled people as a regular part of their clientele, right? And to make sure that spaces and places are accessible. A lot of places in the core people like to romanticize, but they're just not physically accessible. I remember about 4 years ago, I was asked to speak at an event with Manitoba city planners in the downtown core, and I assumed because we were speaking on accessibility issues that the space itself would be accessible. And it's cute and cozy, but it was completely inaccessible. And it's one of the few times in my life that I've allowed complete strangers to carry me into a building, which is not something I do. So I mean, you have to recognize that the in order to be spontaneous, there has to be a level of access and expectation that various bodies use spaces in different ways, and that they have to be expected to be there on a regular basis.
Yeah, sorry, I know we have questions, but sorry, Nancy. I just wanted to finish that. I remember, and I kind of feel bad about this, on our pre-Zoom call where we met and you're talking about your accessibility issues during winter and how you couldn't, you had a lot of trouble, getting around, just as you're mentioning now. And I was thinking about that semi-recently, even just going from my place to my local record store that I love in winter. And I thought, like, I did the whole thing. I walked there and, and came back. And I thought, there's no way in heck she would have been able to do any of that. I barely was able to. And it dawned on me, like, how I think I'm a fairly empathetic person, but even I was not thinking to the degree of you and your, what you need to deal with. And if I'm not thinking about it, I'm sure there's others that are not. Because there's no way you would have been able to go.
And I'm not exaggerating. If I'm to book on to get across the street right now, I have to book on Transit Plus, and I use that term advisedly. That's the name of that's the service. It takes 3 hours to book a ride on Transit Plus at the moment, between 2 and 3 hours depending. But snow removal and ice and snow are so bad at the moment that if I want to go across the street, I have to book a ride, and I have to book it at least 73 hours in advance, and I have to wait 3 hours on the phone to possibly be able to book something. And that's and I'm not saying that to say poor me. I'm just saying, to me, I find it amazing that, number one, that Winnipeg that prides itself on being a winter city, that snow removal is a surprise every year. That boggles my mind. Anyway, that's my point for this.
Thank you, Nancy.
And
That's
thank you for supporting me.
Awesome. Okay, we'll do one quick question to end it off on a positive note of what your favorite place to eat in the core is, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Think about this. Feel free. I think
I don't have a favorite place to eat. I like lots of different places. But I did just discover a place on Notre Dame that I didn't know existed, Cafe on Notre Dame.
Oh, okay.
It's a lovely place if you haven't been there.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Nancy or Albert, do you have any recommendations?
Well, a lot of spaces around the University of Winnipeg I can get into them, so it's exciting. But these days, I use skip the dishes.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, so I used to eat a lot at Pony Corral within University of Winnipeg, but it doesn't look like it's still there anymore. So that was my favorite place.
for me, I'd say probably Peasant Cookery. It's across the street from me.
Yeah.
They have a great beet salad. So.
I would say Clementine is
Yeah,
up there
that's
for
also a
breakfast,
classic,
a classic. Okay, so maybe we'll open it up to questions if anyone has anything to ask. Feel free. I think there's a mic there. You can come up and use the mic. Yeah. Go for it.
So you're talking about, I guess, Winnipeg's core, you know, and the size, but sometimes the emptiness and the difficulty getting around. Would it be fair to say that, you know, Winnipeg's core is perhaps defined by being fairly transportation poor?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Would it be fair to say that Winnipeg's core can be defined as fairly transportation poor? Like cars and buses are, you know, bus systems are designed to move people longer distance, you know, and the core is certainly a bikeable size, and, you know, parts of it are walkable size, but with the lack of maintenance of, you know, just the pedestrian and cycling networks, you know, just, you know, snow and ice, and is that really, you know, do you think it would be fair to define Winnipeg's core as being fairly transportation poor?
I hadn't really thought about it, but I don't know.
I just, for me, the example I would give that's straightforward is I live in the core and I need a car to get my groceries. Mm-hmm. That's the only real option. And that's just so unfortunate, I think. Mm-hmm. That's the best answer I can give anyway.
Yeah. I think also just the fact that there's, you know, two major corridor, like Portage and Main Street are major roads with, you know, like 6 lanes of traffic. There's a focus there, you know, that you can't ignore, that there's thousands of cars every day coming and going on those roads, and to kind of create a, you know, a more walkable, bikeable area, what happens with those? Where do those cars go? And so I do think, in a sense, that it's definitely focused on those, on transportation, for sure. Albert? Oh,
Sorry.
maybe
Go
I'll
ahead.
go to Albert.
Yeah, so I have a slide that I want to share on the screen,
Sure.
which shows, you know, the fact that, you know, a person is more likely to experience transportation disadvantage if they are on low income and they are on minority status. So if you look at this slide, it tells you that within the inner core, we have 51% of residents that commute by car, truck, or van as drivers on their own. That means some of them have cars. And then we have 7% commuting as passengers, and we have 23% that commute by public transport. But Winnipeg's core is accessible because, you know, people have access to bike around as well. So you cannot say that people cannot get on the bus, not because the bus is not accessible, but it's based on the fact that they are poor and they are on low income.
Any other questions? Is that it? Good. Okay. One more?
One thing that I've noticed, I'm a little new to Winnipeg, and about the lack of political will, I think there is a lack of knowledge about how to advocate and how to have political will and speak to policymakers. People just kind of, I don't know what to do. Like, this guy's in the office, he doesn't do anything, he doesn't represent me. I tried voting, you know. Mm-hmm. And I think there is just a lack of culture of write to your ward councillor or write to your MLA, and just really basic practical knowledge outside of, well, is anyone actually telling policymakers what is wrong? Or
I think a lot of people do. I would just suggest that they don't listen for because they've got their own agendas. I firmly believe people are, they're kind of looking at what's popular out there, and they're making decisions based on polling rather than leadership around the issues that we're talking about. I don't think there's a lack of knowledge. I just think that people select what it is that they think is in their best interest, and they move policy forward in that regard. And there are a lot of activists around pushing policy ideas always. I'm sure, many of us are engaged in some of those activities. But, obviously, it's challenging, right? But I don't think it's a lack of knowledge. I think it's a lack of listening to the knowledge.
Nancy, do you want to add anything?
I would second what was just stated. I think there, Winnipeg is full of activism from all types of marginalized population. I mean, Winnipeg is the cradle of the disability rights movement in Canada, but at the present time, I think legislators are more interested in catering to the constituency they think will keep them in power longer, and they're more interested in maintaining their power base as opposed to facilitating substantive change, because they know what's being asked for, but they don't want to do it for a plethora of reasons, which is really unfortunate. And leadership is notoriously absent in all sectors at the present time, and those who are really in the decision-making process choose not to do so.
Oh, I've got one coming up.
Do we have time for one more, or not really sure what the time?
How much time? We're good. I got it.
Hi, I'm just going to strike a little bit more optimistic view. So the Fort White by-election, which we just had, I think there were some of the most outstanding candidates, and it was amazing. So right from, Trudy Schrader, Obi Khan, Willard Reeves, those are not slouches. So I would encourage us to be positive and really try to engage. There are some really wonderful people out there. I was also involved with the City of Winnipeg anti-racism work that's going on, and there was an actual real and quite deep effort to bring people with lived experience into the discussions. So I think historically we haven't done a good job of that, and I would agree completely with what was said. But again, being an optimist, I would say let's just dig deeper and pull more people in. So I don't know that if I have a question as much as just to state some optimism, and I would like to hear an optimistic perspective on. And Nancy, you're amazing. I was listening to just what you're saying. You're really bringing a voice forward. So thank you all.
Just to add maybe to that optimism, I think one of the positive things that we saw out of COVID was, for City Hall, for instance, to be a delegate, it's quite a lot of work. You usually have to book time off work. You're waiting. I don't know if anyone's ever done this before, but it can take a whole day. You got to be at the hall, And by opening it up to having delegates come in on Zoom, that opens a whole window of folks that can, just have that on while they're still doing their job, pop in, say their comments for 10 minutes, or if they have accessibility issues. So I think just building off of those kind of positive things that we've seen come out of COVID, if, there isn't many, but the few that there is, and seeing what can create a wider audience of folks to get involved, I think is really important. Yeah, we've got one more question.
Just a comment. I got a bit pumped with Darcy's invitation because I thought, geez, that's great. It's a position of power. They're inviting you to the table. So I wonder if they would allow you to bring guests with you.
Would they let you bring guests to the table? Is that what I'm hearing?
Sorry, was that your question? I didn't quite
just
hear.
a question. Would they allow you to bring guests that might inform?
Yeah,
the
I
process?
haven't responded yet, but I am when I do.
I just got a bit excited about that.
Sorry?
I got excited by that.
I've been with said person a few weeks ago already for an hour, which frankly just was a photo op for said person. Initials H and S. And but when I respond, I am going to do that as well. I mean, it just goes. I mean, not to go off topic, we're out of time, but it goes to the work itself. What I tell even my staff all the time is, you're essentially going into somebody's home and telling them how to live. So maybe include them in the conversation. So when I do respond, I will bring that, absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just comment on the comment about the optimism, cynicism? Or you didn't say cynicism. I'm the one who was going to say cynicism. I think it's, I think probably we all have optimism, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. So we always have optimism, but that doesn't mean that, it's still fair to be cynical, because, anybody who's been involved in activism for, as many years as some of us have been, it's hard not to be cynical, but we keep doing it because we have optimism always. My optimism right now is that we have an election in the fall, municipal election in the fall. So, we need to bring these sorts of issues forward to look at what kinds of things people have on offer so that we can participate in that particular process, and then hold those folks who are elected accountable. In 2023, we have a provincial election, so the same thing there. So I guess, bringing different ideas forward, which again, many of us are participate in doing, is always, a way of being engaging. So yeah, just to suggest, I don't want to make it sound like there's no optimism. Otherwise, if we weren't optimistic, we probably wouldn't be taking the time to do this today. So yeah, anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
One more question?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I definitely agree. I think the fact that so many activists have been critical, not so necessarily cynical, I would say, you set the foundation for me and everyone else who's like, hell yeah, let's build off of that. Let's take what you've done and say, we're sick of what you had to deal with. Let's move up and move forward with it. So thank you for your cynicism, because I got this, my dude. We do, sorry. I did have a question, because I know when you guys were talking about your neighbors and how you get to know them and everything, I know you guys all actually live in pretty comfortable areas generally, and you are able to leave, and there is not an absence of things to do. I live right downtown, where I am seeing everything close. And it's getting very heartbreaking, the Bay had the opportunity to be taken up by the university for $1, and the university said, no, bad investment. But imagine what that could have been turned into, having university students working in and on the Bay, missed opportunities. And Portage Place was almost a lost cause from Starlight. Optimism, don't worry, it's getting better. But I did have a question of the increase of scarcity happening downtown, and Aurora, you brought up in the last panel the gaps between the areas, and Portage in Maine is inaccessible to anyone with any sort of physical disability, which is disgusting. And Maine itself as a whole has an abundance of pawn shops, and downtown is losing all of its local things that make it beautiful, which makes it scary sometimes for people to leave and be outside. Is there, like, to your knowledge of policies and neighborhood things that can be done, is there, I know that there are neighborhood plans in downtown, development expectations that are in line. Are there ways to amend those plans or have people in those neighborhoods work to advocate for amending them so that there are development expectations set out in line that policymakers and our politicians must follow through in order to actually make these areas flourish for the people?
Yes, there is. There is. Not to. I'm not with. I don't work for the city, so I'm not 100% on all of their policies or anything. But I do know there is actually a lot of work being done right now for the downtown specifically, mostly because of COVID and the losses we've seen. So I know there's a committee we sit on to advocate for things that we see are missing. The downtown biz is on that committee, as well as policymakers and urban planners. So that's very positive. And there is money coming from the provincial government and the federal government and the municipal government to really bring back our downtown, because we were starting to go on an upward trend, and then COVID really took us back a few years. So that's very positive for us to see, as well as I think you're right that this shift of it needs to be a downtown that's more than just people working there. And so a lot of, they're looking at ways, to kind of take back some of the red tape maybe on development, but also making sure that development is sticking to, for instance, our Winnipeg plan, which is what we want our Winnipeg to be. And there's policies in that plan that, height restrictions and park mandates and things like that they must follow. So I think just making sure you're advocating where you can, whether it's your local city councillor or, planning committees in the city, that's super important. And, if you've got, I know sometimes the downtown and even in the Exchange, it can feel like you don't really have a neighborhood association as much as maybe other neighborhoods, such as the West End. There's a few in the West End. But, just getting folks together and really advocating on what you want to see in the downtown is super important. And Albert, maybe I'll pass it to you. I see your hands up. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so there is a slide that I have that I want to show, and that is an addition to what you've said, which is fine. The city of Winnipeg has identified higher needs areas, and the highest concentration of needs are within the inner city. And what I can say is that community activists and community-based organizations are pushing through to make sure that all the key areas and are being tackled. So issues that has to do with crime, that has to do with racism, housing, and all those things are being tackled. So thanks for share. So this is the map that the city identified based on the core issues affecting people in the core. So
Hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd just also like to suggest that just because there isn't a neighborhood association doesn't mean you can't form one,
Yes,
or at least with the people in your small little community, so that you could actively engage and, feel that you have a bit more power, especially engaging in the election that's coming up. So anyway.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're good. Any?
Thank you, friends. I just wanted to make a point here. Like, it looks like the audience is a little bit thin today, this morning, because it's their first and Thursday. But every single one of you that is here matters and has a role. There's like the local newspaper from the neighborhood. There's somebody from Bike Winnipeg. There are people that are thinking about our city here, engaged with 3 local people, 5 local people. That we're all living in Winnipeg. There's, that we have a foreign expert coming to help us, but these are all people that live in Winnipeg that are already thinking about our city and the city that we want to live in. So I would say 2 things. First, every single one of these people that are in the audience could send an email to their, local politician and say, hey, I attended the Winterruption Summit and this is what I learned, and you should know better, or this is what you're doing right, or whatever you want to say to them. But if we're talking about engagement, that's the first step. And second, I think the point of this is to plant seeds, and I think we've been very successful at that. Now we have to keep watering those brain ideas so that they keep growing. Thank you, everybody. Don't go too far, because El León and the Strangers are going to play a set of really cool music next.